Okay, today, let's talk about The Mandalorian. Surprisingly, the show was actually so good. In fact, this was more interesting than what the recent trilogy had to offer. Now, I'm aware that some people hate Star Wars 7 to 9, but don't worry about it, I'm not going to hate, and in fact I understand both sides as a fan of the movies. In my childhood I actually liked the previous trilogy the most, yes, the notorious Star Wars 1 to 3. It looked awesome in my eyes, the effects back then were groundbreaking, the Star Wars universe was bigger than what we realized, and the civilizations and cultures presented were diverse and expansive before Palpatine became Emperor. The racing event, General Grievous, the dynamic fight scenes, these were all factors that got me to stay awake as a kid, since I had this bad habit of just sleeping through masterpieces like The Lord of the Rings and the first Star Wars trilogy. Hey, cut me some slack, they were boring for a child, but some of the critics who loved Star Wars 4 to 6 didn't like Star Wars 1 to 3 for various reasons that are actually similar to what the recent trilogy is facing right now. Well, many years later, I finally understand why these lines were cringy.
I don't like sand. It's coarse, rough and irritating.
Why this character was a mistake, and how political lines like these were alarming to a lot of people.
I love democracy. I love the Republic.
Oh, the joys of being ignorant to all of these. Sometimes you just have to enjoy a show without being serious about it. Although, why is The Mandalorian the real successor to the first Star Wars trilogy? It's not as generous with the effects like the previous trilogy that I liked as a child, and it's not as expansive as the current trilogy that is so rich with lore and culture. What does this show have that the succeeding movies lacked? Well, first of all, what The Mandalorian showed us is actually something new. Even though it's set within the Star Wars universe, it felt different from the get-go. There were no Jedi and Sith, and the place that our protagonist lived in was far from the Republic and the Empire, and there was no hint of Skywalkers at all, which is so refreshing. Although, sure, Baby Yoda is technically part of the Jedi side of it, but the Mandalorian himself is the driving force of the story, and he is not a Jedi himself. This show actually reminded me of Cowboy Bebop. Despite having a space theme, it actually felt like watching an old Wild West movie. Mixing genres might have been risky, but Jon Favreau made it work. I sense a little bit of Iron Man in the show as well, but in the end The Mandalorian is its own unique thing. Now, honestly, if you compare effects and CGI from one movie to another in this day and age, it kinda puts old movies at a disadvantage. I can easily make a criteria that gives Star Wars 1 to 6 some considerations when we compare them to Star Wars 7 to 9 and The Mandalorian, but it would be unfair to refute the innovations that we achieved with the technology we use today. Although, currently there has been this trend from critics who actually give demerits for too much CGI in a movie. This was also the criticism that Star Wars 1 to 3 got back in the day, since Star Wars 4 to 6 was so clever in using toys and daring for doing stunts while using real costumes most of the time rather than a green screen suit. To some degree, I actually agree that more CGI doesn't make a movie better, and there are also times when it gets in the way, and due to the abundance of it in movies nowadays, I guess people are fed up with it. So in the end, Star Wars 1 to 3 didn't lack something. The problem was that it had too much CGI, too much action, and too much unnecessary dialogue. The Mandalorian prevailed with its simplicity. Well, sure, I don't doubt that a lot of the scenery is actually filled with CGI and I just didn't notice it, but the show isn't as flashy as the movies. The action and power creep was reasonable enough, and the dialogue between characters were concise and with a purpose. Since there isn't a grand civilization, or looming great war on the horizon, or a royal bloodline that decides the fate of the universe,
I am your father.
the atmosphere that the story presents is desolate, yet it's actually not an empty shell, and it gives this impression that the universe is so vast and not everything actually revolves around the Skywalkers or the Sith, but rather the series show the journey of those who are considered to be on the sidelines. Like, people wonder what happened after the Empire was defeated, and it turns out that there are worlds out there in the Star Wars universe that operates independently, and this was shown with only a small amount of special effects and animation. Now, the reason why I think that CGI is not entirely bad is because there are cases when it actually works. In Final Fantasy Kingsglaive for example, you'll see how amazing it is to have a movie that's just 100% CGI, like the objects in here just look so real, until magic and people show up. It's better than what we had decades ago, but I can still tell that these things are not real. If technology advances even further, then maybe the next CGI movies might have better textures for human skin. Just watching the scenery alone was already breathtaking, but if the writing isn't good enough then all of it will be for naught. With CGI, directors can be more ambitious and the writers will have less problems in translating the events they have in mind through virtual reality, and the biggest thing in my opinion is that it prevents tragedies like what happened with Resident Evil wherein the stunt double got into an accident just because the director wanted an impossible shot.
But they just didn't lift the camera in time, so I went straight into it. I mean, it hit me here on my face and my shoulder.
For now, all we can do is appreciate the latest developments and ignore the stingy critics. Next is the lore and culture. Since it's the 7th to 9th sequel of the movie, I was actually surprised as to why the recent trilogy was criticized for explaining and revealing a lot of things. I am aware that an unsolved mystery in a story is a really good hook that keeps the audience wondering what the answer actually is, and the interest on how everything in the story works will increase as sequels only reveal clues or add more to the mystery. Avatar, for example, had a mesmerizing magic system. It was just a basic fantasy wherein the heroes could manipulate the elements in their world. Unfortunately, the mystery was broken when Avatar Korra had that origin story revealed. So in that show, it was understandable why explaining and revealing a lot of things was egregious since it was just too early. With Star Wars, however, it actually made sense why there's little to no mysticism about the Force at that point, why the final battle turned out to be just two opposing great forces duking it out with all they've got. BS or not, the movies were at its last leg, but somehow, here's where The Mandalorian comes in. Due to its subtlety, the mysticism that the succeeding sequels lacked somehow returned. Fans who have watched the animated series, read the books and comics, etc. may know what the things are and who the characters are in the Mandalorian series, but unlike the movies, everyone doesn't know what's next, regardless of what fans know now. Only the writers know what Season 2 entails, hence the show was more interesting due to its unpredictability. I'm also aware that the Star Wars universe is still filled with stories that are yet to be told in the cinema, but what I mean about Star Wars is at its last leg is that I'm assuming that Disney is not going to make Star Wars 10 to 12 and let the Skywalkers retire for 2 generations. With these explanations, I can conclude that The Mandalorian is the true successor of the first Star Wars trilogy, not because the succeeding sequels actually lack something, but rather, they actually just had too much on everything. Star Wars 4 to 6 was loved by its simplicity.
You don't need to see his identification.
We don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
The power creep was not as drastic as episode 1 to 3 showed. The magic of space magic was still mysterious in the series as well, and whether you like it or not, the real ending of Star Wars was at episode 6 where everyone celebrated and lived happily ever after. Well, this is just the beginning. I hope they'll give us another good season. Best of luck to them. There might have been a kerfuffle with the actors involved, but hopefully the issues get resolved without having to remove and replace them since their performance appeared to be spectacular. I'm also predicting that Disney will now fully support the show, and I wouldn't be surprised if it gets its own movie in the near future as well. That's all for now, thanks for watching.